With our UI set up, we're ready to actually add our player to the game. So we're going to start by collapsing our canvas if it's not collapsed already by clicking this arrow here. We're also going to make sure we switch back to our scene view. And so what we want to do is make sure that we're in our cave. So we might have moved out our camera to get into or edit our UI. So if we expand our cave and select one of these objects and then put our mouse over the scene view and press F, that'll pull us right back. Or we can just right click in the scene and use WASD to move back over to where our cave is. And we're going to collapse cave again. And so what we need to do is add a player object to the scene. So rather than use a player model like we have in previous projects, since this is a first-person game, we can actually use pretty much any shape we want. The player is never going to see themselves, so we're just going to use a 3D object by right-clicking the hierarchy, selecting 3D object, and creating a capsule. And if we're in our cave, it should spawn it somewhere in our cave. This works perfectly. What we're then going to do is drag that over to the ground. You know, it doesn't have to be right on the ground, but we want it to be close. There we go. And next what we're going to do is over on our inspector panel here, is we're going to hit the add component button. We're going to add a rigid body. And this is important because this is actually how we're going to move our player. We want to expand this rigid body with the drop down arrow and then go to the constraints option here and expand that with the drop down arrow. And what we're going to do is this freeze rotation field here, we're going to check all three of these boxes. And that's just going to ensure that when we're playing, our player, if they bump into something, they're not going to like fall over or get get the camera messed up or something along those lines. What we also want to do is make sure we go to the top of the inspector and rename our player to player. We're also going to select the player tag, and we're going to select the player layer. All three of those things are very important, but we'll get into that a little bit more into that later on. Now that we've got our rigid body, our tag, and our layer set up, we're now going to hit the add component option. We're going to hit new script, and in this field here, we're going to type player controller. What that's going to do is create a new script for us called player controller. But one thing to note, and this is a very important thing to note, is that when you create a script this way, it's going to create it in our assets folder. So if we're still in our props folder, we can hit this assets button here, and it's going to take us back to the assets folder. Our script is here in the assets folder, and while it will work while it's here, you will not be able to get credit for it in your check setup button when you're going to hit the button to get credit for this step. So what we want to do is actually move this into resources, and then we're going to move this into scripts, and we can do this by just clicking and dragging it onto the folder. And then inside scripts, there's just two more folders. Not sure why Visual Studio wanted to open there. We'll let it close. And then inside the scripts folder, we want to move player controller into created. And that's because on this project, we've provided some scripts for you, but we want to make sure that we're keeping the scripts that we've provided and that you've created separate from each other. Like here's the scripts that we're providing, but we're gonna move player controller into this created folder. Once you've got it moved, we can go ahead and double click on it here and open it up. And we've got our default class here is what this is called. It comes with this void update and this void start function, as well as what this is called as a comment. And this is a line of text that's not counted as code. And this is just telling you how these void update and void start methods work. And yes, these are called methods. They're denoted by these open and close parentheses after the start word, or after the word here, as well as it requires these brackets to be featured after the parentheses. So what we want to do to start is click right next to this top bracket here. We don't want to be behind it, but in front of it. And we're going to hit the enter key a couple times to give us some space. And we're going to start by declaring what are called some variables. We do this by just typing what we want the variable type to be, and then its name. So we're going to start with a rigid body. And we're going to say rigid is what that's called. And we want to make sure we have these semicolons after every line. Otherwise, your code is going to cause some errors. We're going to do a vector3 move dir with a capital D. Make sure you're matching my capitalization on all of this stuff. Otherwise, you're going to get some errors. we're going to say new vector3 0 0 0, and that's inside of parentheses here, and then our semicolon. We're going to say vector3 current velocity. We're going to use that to track our player's movement speed. We're now going to add some public variables by typing public text. Oops. Oh, actually, the reason we only want the word text here, but you'll notice it's underlined in red for me, and when I tried to type it the first time, it gave me that text alignment thing. That's because we need to do what's called including the UI classes. So to do that, we have to click up at the top underneath Unity Engine. We can hit enter to give some space. If we click outside of the semicolon, we're going to say using Unity Engine.ui. And we want to make sure we, of course, include the semicolon there. And you'll notice that that turned text to green. And that means that we can use the text class and edit our UI text. And we're going to name this variable health text. And then finally, we're going to say public game object game over. And we're not going to touch that one for a little while, but it's important to get it in there up front just so that we know it's there when we need it. Now we're going to click into our void start function here, and we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to click in there, and we're going to type rigid equals get component, and then in these angled brackets, if you hold shift and hit the comma or period key, you'll get those. We're going to say rigid body, and then open and close parentheses and our semicolon. And what this is going to do is get that rigid body component that we added to our player. We're going to actually get it assigned to a variable. That way we can manipulate it as needed. Once you've got that in there, go ahead and save your script by again pressing Control or Command S, and you'll know you saved if that little asterisk goes away in the top left. Or you can hit File and go to the Save Assets button, and you'll notice it says Control S here, telling you can just hit those buttons to save a little bit faster.